Everyone ignored her, until one man stood up. That man was Chuck Norris, and no one saw it coming. This is not just a story. This is a moment that changes everything. If you've ever wondered if there is still justice in the world, stay tuned. Because this trip will show you who really has the power. Post in the comments, where are you watching from? The morning rush in New York City was as relentless as ever. The subway car was packed to the brim with commuters, each lost in their own world. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, damp coats, and the faint metallic tang of the train's machinery. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks provided a steady backdrop to the hum of conversations, the occasional rustle of newspapers, and the soft clicks of smartphones. Among the sea of indifferent faces, a modest woman in her mid-50s carefully stepped into the crowded car. Her name was Annie Norris. She was petite, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that seemed almost out of place in the harsh, hurried environment of the city. Dressed in a simple coat and scarf, she carried 2 heavy bags of groceries, their contents peeking out: fresh vegetables, a loaf of bread, and a carton of eggs. She maneuvered through the tight space with quiet apologies, finally settling into a corner seat near the door. The other passengers barely noticed her. Most were too engrossed in their own lives to pay attention to the woman with the grocery bags. A man in a suit scrolled through his emails. A teenager bobbed his head to music blasting through his headphones, and a young couple whispered to each other, oblivious to the world around them. It was just another morning in the city, where anonymity was both a shield and a burden. But not everyone in the car was content to mind their own business. A young man, no older than 20, lounged against a pole in the center of the car. He was tall and wiry, with a cocky smirk that hinted at a need for attention. His clothes were loud: ripped jeans, a leather jacket, and a baseball cap turned backward. He exuded an air of defiance, the kind that dared anyone to challenge him. His eyes scanned the car, searching for something or someone to entertain him. His gaze landed on Annie. At first, it was subtle. A snicker, a muttered comment to no one in particular. But as the train jolted forward and the passengers swayed with the motion, his voice grew louder. "Hey, lady," he called out, his tone dripping with mockery. "What's with all the groceries? Planning a feast or something?" A few passengers glanced up but quickly looked away, unwilling to get involved. Annie kept her eyes down, pretending not to hear him. She adjusted her grip on the bags and focused on the floor, hoping he would lose interest. But the young man wasn't deterred. Emboldened by her silence and the lack of intervention from the other passengers, he took a step closer. "What's in the bags, huh? Fancy stuff? Or just the cheap junk?" He laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed in the confined space. The tension in the car began to rise. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Annie and the young man. But no one spoke up. No one intervened. It was the unspoken rule of the city. Don't get involved. Keep your head down and mind your own business. Annie's hands tightened around the straps of her bags. She could feel the weight of the young man's gaze, the heat of his words pressing down on her. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the background and escape the humiliation. But there was nowhere to go. She was trapped, both by the crowded car and by the oppressive silence of the other passengers. In the corner of the car, seated just a few feet away from Annie, was a man who had remained silent throughout the ordeal. He was older, with a weathered face and a calm, steady presence. His cowboy hat, a rare sight in the city, sat low on his head, casting a shadow over his piercing blue eyes. He wore a simple jacket and jeans, his posture relaxed but alert. He had been watching the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. As the young man continued his taunts, the cowboy's hand rested lightly on his knee. He didn't move, didn't speak, but there was something about him, an unspoken authority, a quiet strength, that seemed to radiate from his very being. The other passengers, though they didn't realize it yet, would soon learn that this man was no ordinary commuter. And neither was Annie. The tense atmosphere in the crowded subway car deepened as the young troublemaker's verbal barbs grew louder and more cutting. His mocking tone, laced with sarcasm, echoed off the metal walls of the train, ensuring that every ear present was forced to register his cruel words. "Hey, lady, you planning a banquet with that feast of yours?" he jeered, his voice rising in volume as he sneered at Annie Norris. His comments seemed calculated to embarrass, his eyes dancing with malicious amusement as he scrutinized every detail of her modest appearance and the well-worn bags she held. Around them, the faces of other commuters remained a patchwork of indifference and discomfort, most engrossed in their own thoughts, rushing to work, checking texts on their phones, or simply lost in the drone of urban routine, barely turned their eyes toward the escalating scene. A few startled expressions appeared briefly, but they soon gave way to the customary avoidance. None of the passengers, despite the injustice unfolding before them, mustered the courage to speak up. Their silence was palpable, an unspoken agreement to ignore the transgression rather than disrupt the fragile calm of their morning commute. The young man's mocking escalated. He started to list off disparaging comments about her appearance, unnecessarily loud and pointed, as if his sole purpose was to reduce a quiet, unassuming woman to a spectacle for his amusement. "What, you think those bags make you look fancy? Look at you!" he laughed, relishing every sneer, every snicker that rippled through a handful of onlookers. His voice carried with it a sense of entitlement, as if his opinion were the only one that mattered in that confined space. Every time he punctuated his tirade with a burst of laughter, the train's cramped interior took on the heavy atmosphere of collective resignation. People shifted in their seats or avoided eye contact, their faces betraying helplessness and a muted disapproval. A middle-aged man in a faded business suit clutched his briefcase a little tighter, while a young college student fiddled with his earbuds, his eyes fixed on the window as if he wished to escape the situation altogether. The bystander's silence, however, was not born of agreement but of an ingrained cultural reluctance to intervene in someone else's conflict, a reluctance that, in that moment, amplified Annie's isolation. Annie, for her part, sat as motionless as possible, her hands trembling slightly around the straps of her grocery bags. Her eyes were cast downward, and she offered no reply to the young man's cruel words, only a sorrowful look that revealed her wounded pride and exhaustion at having to endure this humiliation. With every insult, her inner resolve appeared to shrink further, and the spectral feeling of isolation wrapped even tighter around her fragile being. Still, her silence was not entirely of her own choosing. Rather, it was imposed upon her by the crushing indifference of a society too afraid to confront cruelty in public. Then, as if the verbal mockery was not enough, the situation took a darker turn. The young man stepped closer to Annie, his presence looming as he moved in for a more invasive display of aggression. His voice, now laced with condescension and barely concealed hostility, filled the tiny space. "I bet those groceries look even cheaper when you drop them," he whispered just loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear, his tone thick with derision. His words cut through the muffled hum of the train like a shard of glass. Without warning, he shoved Annie sharply. The sudden force, unexpected amid the clamor of daily rhythm in the subway, sent her staggering sideways onto the floor. In a dismal cascade, the carefully packed groceries, her modest provisions for the morning, spilled open onto the grimy floor of the carriage. Crumpled papers, loose fruits, a broken carton of eggs, all of it scattered across the floor like the shattered remnants of her dignity. For a few agonizing seconds, the entire car fell into a stifling silence, the echo of the impact lingering as if time itself had been punctured. Eyes darted around the compartment, but no one moved. The shock was shared instantly by all. A collective breath held in dismay at the blatant act of aggression. Some passengers averted their eyes in discomfort. Others fumbled with their phones but dared not record further, as if paralyzed by responsibility or perhaps by an ingrained fear of interference. In that suspended moment, the only sounds were the soft rustle of fallen groceries and the muffled, hesitant murmurs of passengers too stunned to speak louder. At the center of this fraught tableau was still the young man, who, instead of showing genuine concern for his victim, let out a derisive laugh, his eyes still shining with the thrill of having provoked a reaction. But then, Amid the rising tension and the deafening silence that had enveloped the compartment, a subtle yet unmistakable stir began to take shape at the periphery. Seated unobtrusively a few rows away was a man unlike any other passenger in the car, a figure whose presence seemed to command quiet respect. He wore a battered cowboy hat that shaded eyes so blue and penetrating that they looked as if they had witnessed decades of hardship and quiet triumph. His clothes were simple, just well-worn jeans and a plain shirt, yet there was something undeniably authoritative about his posture. Up until now, he had maintained a silence that was almost meditative, but as the scene unfolded, an imperceptible resolve began to coalesce in his calm demeanor. The air in the car grew charged, as if the moment poised on a knife's edge between abuse and redemption. Passengers continued to watch in morbid fascination. Some whispered among themselves in hushed tones, while others recorded the soul-crushing scene with expressions of disbelief. The young bully, emboldened by the absence of immediate retribution, leaned in further, readying himself for another wave of cruelty. It was at that juncture, a culmination of humiliation, silent complicity, and the pervasive dread of intervening, that the man in the cowboy hat rose slowly from his seat. For now, the atmosphere in the subway car was a live wire of tension, each second stretching out interminably as every soul present recognized that something pivotal was about to happen. With a steadying breath and the weight of unforeseen authority behind him, the older man prepared to step forward, setting the stage for a moment that would soon redefine the notions of true strength and dignity. As the echoes of the bully's harsh laughter faded into the uneasy silence of the subway car, all eyes shifted toward the man in the cowboy hat. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat with a quiet dignity that contrasted starkly with the obvious malice of the young troublemaker. His weathered face, lined with decades of hard-won experience, bore an expression of steady resolve. The battered cowboy hat, now tilted forward to cast his intense, unwavering gaze over the scene, marked him not as a casual observer, but as someone who understood that true strength is measured in restraint and moral fortitude. The bully, still flushed with the thrill of his earlier display, noticed the movement. With a self-assured smirk tugging at his lips, he took a step forward, his eyes glinting with the prospect of another opportunity to belittle Norris. Emboldened by the silence of the other passengers and eager to sustain his reign of cruelty, he prepared to strike once more. At that very moment, the tension in the carriage became almost palpable. The rhythmic clatter of the train tried in vain to drown out the charged silence that clung to the air. Around them, once indifferent faces now watched with a mixture of dread and anticipation, some capturing the unfolding drama on their mobile phones, others simply unable to tear their eyes away from this sudden pivot in momentum. Annie sat frozen, her bags of spilled groceries at her feet like scattered remnants of dignity. Her eyes widened with fear and sorrow. While part of her pleaded to shrink back into the anonymity of the crowd, another part clung desperately to the hope that her quiet suffering might finally be addressed. It was in that charged moment that the man in the cowboy hat advanced a step forward. His gait was measured, deliberate, exuding an almost imperceptible calm that belied the storm of emotion swirling beneath his composed exterior. The bully's laughter faltered as his eyes met the steely glare of the rising protector. In a voice that cut through the oppressive silence, a voice neither raised nor shouted, but imbued with an authority that demanded attention, the man spoke. "Show some respect," he uttered, his words measured and low, yet resonating with the weight of conviction. The simple command seemed to suspend time. For a heartbeat, every sound in the car was reduced to the collective breath of anticipation. His tone left no room for misinterpretation. Further aggression would no longer be tolerated. As if struck by an invisible force, the bully's smirk faltered. His eyes, once alight with malicious amusement, now darted about uncertainly. The protective man's calm was not a display of brute force but a demonstration of controlled power, an unspoken reminder that dignity and self-control were the true measures of strength. The bully hesitated, his hands suspended in midair as if caught in the act, and the entire train seemed to hold its breath. All at once, a hush fell over the compartment. Every passenger, previously complicit in their silence, now bore witness to a defining moment. The bully's mouth opened half in a stutter as he searched for words, seeking to justify his actions or perhaps to deflect the rising tide of accountability that now loomed before him. Discomfort replaced his earlier bravado. The atmosphere became heavy with the collective realization that what had begun as petty bullying was transforming into a matter of moral reckoning. Without a single angry shout or a demonstrative gesture of violence, the man in the cowboy hat stood as a living emblem of restraint and righteous defense. His eyes, dark and profound, conveyed centuries of pain and wisdom, and for a moment, the entire carriage understood that true protection did not require fists or aggression. It required an unyielding commitment to honor, dignity, and the peaceful redress of wrongs. Some passengers dared to exchange glances of awe and relief. A young mother clutched the hand of her child a little tighter, while an older gentleman lowered his newspaper, recognizing that the spectacle unfolding was more than a mere confrontation. It was a lesson in the strength of character. The bully, now visibly shaking with uncertainty and a dawning fear of the consequences of his actions, took an involuntary step back. His aggressive posture collapsed into an insecure slouch as he struggled to reconcile his earlier defiance with the stern reality mirrored in the protector's gaze. Still, the bully's next move was imminent. He appeared to gather his resolve, reaching out as if to launch another verbal attack or perhaps a physical one. But before he could complete his gesture, the man in the cowboy hat's intense gaze stopped him, an unspoken promise that any further transgression would be met with a firm and decisive response. In that frozen moment, the weight of his words and the quiet power of his presence left the bully paralyzed, caught between the urge to assert dominance and the overwhelming force of moral accountability that now filled the car. It was in this silence that the truth resonated most clearly. The strength of a protector is not measured by the volume of one's voice or the size of one's muscles, but by the unwavering conviction to stand up for what is right, even if only with a single sentence. In that moment, as the bully's confidence shattered under the weight of the protector's stoic presence, the entire train bore witness to a timeless lesson, the kind that challenges bystanders to reflect on their own silence, and that redefines what it means to have courage. Annie, in the midst of her quiet suffering, felt a glimmer of hope. Though her eyes brimmed with unshed tears from the humiliation and the abrupt spill of her groceries, she also recognized that justice was emerging, not in the form of loud confrontation, but in the dignified defiance of one man standing for another. And as the train continued its relentless journey through the city, every soul present would remember that day as the moment when true strength was heralded by quiet courage, accountability, and an unyielding insistence on respect. In that charged moment when every heart in the crowded subway car seemed to be suspended between dread and reluctant compassion, the man in the cowboy hat, stern, weathered, and resolute, took a deliberate step forward. The bully, frozen mid-air in his attempt to launch another verbal barb or perhaps a further physical shove, felt his pulse hammering in his ears. The remaining passengers, who had until then been painfully silent, instinctively leaned in closer, as if this final act might shatter the icy veneer of indifference that had long held them captive. For several agonizing seconds, nothing stirred except the subdued murmur of the train and the occasional metallic clatter of a passing pole. In that suspended instant, every eye in the carriage focused on the calm figure of the protector. His cowboy hat, frayed yet dignified, cast a long shadow over his deep-set eyes, a pair that carried the weight of countless unspoken stories and lived injustice. His voice, when he finally spoke, was neither raised nor aggressive, but measured, clear, and imbued with an unyielding authority. In a single, unadorned sentence he spoke, "Respect her, because the woman you dare to harm is the wife of a legend, and legends demand honor." The words hit the air like a guillotine swing. Instantly, the entire compartment fell eerily silent. For a heartbeat, even the incessant clatter of the train seemed to pause in deference. The bully's smirk evaporated in a visceral transformation. His bravado crumbled into wide-eyed disbelief, and his sneering glare shifted into one of sheer terror. Around him, subtle ripples of shock spread outwards. Faces that had been turned away in feigned indifference now brimmed with an acute awareness of what they had hitherto overlooked, that in silence, meek complicity allowed cruelty to persist. The power of that one sentence wasn't merely in the recognition of who Annie Norris was. It was in the assertion that any act of abuse, however quiet or petty, would no longer be tolerated when met with unwavering moral strength. For those in the carriage, this was a moment of metamorphosis. The silence that gripped them was no longer the silence of bystanders turned to stone by fear or apathy. It was the silence of a collective conscience awakened. Some passengers who had earlier furtively recorded the incident now lowered their devices, their eyes reflecting remorse and a dawning realization of their own inaction. Even the bully, who until that very moment had been the unchallenged center of derision, seemed to shrink into himself, his lips parted in an unspoken question. "What have I done?" His arms fell limply by his sides as if the weight of the protector's words had physically sapped him of all the will to continue his assault. Annie, still seated on the floor with scattered groceries around her, looked up hesitantly. In that frozen instant, her tearful eyes met the steady gaze of her defender. Not with anger, but with a fragile spark of hope. The protective aura emanating from the man in the cowboy hat filled her with both relief and a quiet dignity that told her she was seen, she was worth defending, and her suffering was not in vain. The reverberations continued. One by one, murmurs began to form into tiny, tremulous claps, hesitant, then strengthening into a modest, yet sincere, applause. It was as if the entire vehicle had collectively decided that silence was no longer acceptable. The bully, his expression a tapestry of shame and panic, backed away slowly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. His earlier laughter was now replaced by the scant sound of his labored breathing. The room's mood had irrevocably shifted, from a bystander's inert passivity to an atmosphere charged with moral accountability. Every passenger in the car seemed compelled to reflect on that solitary sentence. To them, it was a reminder that true strength is not measured by muscle or volume, but by the dignity one protects, by the courage required to stand up, even with a single line, against injustice. In that brief, crystalline moment, the train was transformed into a microcosm of what society might be if morality and empathy replaced indifference. The protector then paused, letting his words sink deeply into the hearts around him. The hum of conversation, long restricted by collective reticence, returned in whispers of introspection. Some looked down, ashamed of their earlier inaction. Others stared openly, as if trying to memorize this lesson for the hard days ahead. The bully, unable to meet the gaze of anyone in the car, muttered incoherently before slinking back into his seat at the far end. As if retreating from a personal reckoning, he could neither contest nor forget. In that heartbeat of silence, the railway car had become more than a vessel in transit. It had evolved into a space of moral confrontation. Nobody needed to raise their voices any further. The cowboy-hatted defender, with nothing more than that one sentence, had drawn a line in the haze of apathy that often smothered everyday life. His words, echoing off the metal walls, left a resounding impact that promised a turning point in not only this confrontation, but in the shared future of all who bore witness. As the train resumed its steady clatter along the tracks, every individual aboard carried with them a transformed perspective, a silent vow that when true strength is required, even the softest voice, armed with dignity, can shatter the silence of injustice. In the aftermath of that one defining sentence, the atmosphere aboard the crowded subway car shifted even further. The bully, his bravado utterly deflated by the protector's measured authority, hesitated, a momentary lapse in his cruelty that swiftly spiraled into full-blown panic. His eyes, once alight with mockery, now widened with shock and undeniable fear as he slowly backed away. The young troublemaker, realizing that his intimidation had lost its potency, stammered a half-hearted apology before bolting from the car, disappearing into the throng of commuters. His retreat was unceremonious, a hasty exit that left behind only the lingering echo of his earlier insults. A heavy silence suffused the car. The once dismissive laughter and the casual amusement of the bystanders evaporated, replaced by a potent mix of shame and introspection. Many passengers, who had earlier hidden behind their phones or shied away from the situation, began to fidget in their seats or lower their devices, suddenly aware that they had remained spectators to injustice. The protective man in the cowboy hat, who had risen to confront the bully with those resonant words, stood motionless for several long moments. His eyes swept across the carriage, silently acknowledging the quiet transformation stirring among the onlookers. Yet, even as the immediate conflict subsided, a deeper responsibility lingered in the air, the unspoken, ethical rebuke of collective indifference. After a few agonizing seconds of this collective stillness, the protective presence, now unmistakably that of the legendary Chuck Norris himself, stepped away from his earlier position. The transformation was subtle but significant. Though he had maintained his quiet authority, his weathered features and steely, knowing eyes now carried the unmistakable weight of a man whose very reputation demanded respect. With measured steps, he walked toward the group of passengers huddled at the far end of the car, the ones who had been busy recording the whole ordeal on their smartphones. Their faces, once indifferent and self-absorbed, now betrayed hints of guilt and contemplation. As he approached, the ambient murmur of the train faded under the gravity of his silent presence. The passengers, fingertips lightly stilling on their screens, instantly recognized that a new reckoning was about to be pronounced. With a calm yet piercing tone that cut through the collective silence like a clarion call, Chuck addressed them plainly, his voice carrying authority and a deep moral conviction. "You can post this video, but when you do, include the truth that you remained silent while this woman was being assaulted." At these words, the train car seemed to hold its breath. For a few heartbeats, every face in the carriage fixed upon his figure, their expressions shifting from detached amusement to palpable shame. Some of the younger passengers, who had prided themselves on capturing everything for likes and shares, now lowered their phones. A tear or two glistened in the eyes of individuals who had once found it easier to laugh than to act. An elderly woman, clutching her purse, whispered softly to her neighbor, I can't believe I did nothing." The confession, unbidden and raw, spread through the crowd like ripples in water. The power of his single injunction was profound. It redefined the narrative in that cramped space. This was no longer just about a petty act of bullying on a morning train. It had become a testament to the cost of inaction and the true measure of strength. True strength, as Chuck's gravelly tone imparted, was not about fortifying one's pride with loud voices or physical intimidation. It was about the quiet courage to protect another, and the moral fortitude to stand up against injustice even when everyone else remains complicit in silence. Some passengers began to weep openly, tears streaming down faces that had earlier been impassive. Their outbursts were not of anger at the bully anymore, but of remorse for their own indifference, their failure to intervene when they saw a fellow human being humiliated. The atmosphere in the car, once preoccupied with the minutiae of daily routine and distraction, had metamorphosed into a crucible of collective conscience. Across the silent space, the echo of his words lingered chastely. The protective aura of the cowboy-hatted man, who was none other than the living embodiment of a legend, had redefined what it meant to be strong. It was not about the physical act of confrontation, but about holding oneself accountable to a higher standard of decency. In that moment, every passenger was forced to confront a piece of their moral self, the question of whether their silence might have allowed cruelty to persist. Realizing the power of his statement, Chuck offered a final, solemn nod before returning to his seat. Slowly, other passengers began to exchange looks of resolve, a tacit promise that they, too, would strive to be more than passive observers. The bully's absence was a stark reminder that the tide of public conscience can indeed sweep away cruelty when met with unwavering moral clarity. In the midst of scattered groceries and the residual echoes of injustice, the lesson was clear. True power does not come from shouting or brute force, but from the quiet dignity that defies evil with restraint, compassion, and an unyielding demand for respect. As the train resumed its journey through the bustling underground of New York, every passenger carried with them a newfound awareness, a challenge to break the silence in the face of wrong. A suffocating silence hung over the subway car in the long aftermath of the confrontation, as if every heart present had been momentarily awakened to the gravity of the event. The bully had long since fled, leaving behind only a shaken remnant of his earlier cruelty. The protective man in the cowboy hat, whose simple yet potent words had halted further abuse, stood as a silent sentinel amid scattered grocery bags and tear-streaked faces. Now, the weight of what had just transpired pressed down upon everyone in the car, transforming a petty brawl into a profound reckoning with personal inaction. Slowly, heads that had been bowed in indifference began to lift. The once oblivious passengers, many still clutching their smartphones, stared at their screens and then at one another with dawning realization. For the first time, the spectators recognized their own silence as an accomplice to cruelty. The initial shock of witnessing violence had given way to a heavy understanding. Each recorded moment was tainted by their failure to help, each digital capture a testament to their passive complicity. After several heartbeats of stifled remorse, the man in the cowboy hat moved deliberately toward the small cluster of passengers huddled around their devices. His every step was measured, as if carrying the weight of countless generations that had borne witness to injustice. As he neared, his eyes, intense and unwavering, swept over the faces of the onlookers, now reflecting a mixture of guilt and introspection. With a voice that was both low and profoundly clear, he spoke to the group, dispelling any lingering pretense of detachment. You can post this video, but when you do, add the truth that you remained silent while this woman was being hit. For a moment, time seemed to freeze within the cramped train car. The words, simple yet inescapably powerful, struck each person like a blow of conscience. Eyes widened in shock. Some of the younger passengers, who had earlier filmed the scene with a sense of detached voyeurism, now lowered their smartphones slowly, their fingers trembling. In the hushed air, a few fragile tears broke free. One elderly man's eyes glistened as if he could no longer bear the weight of his silence. A timid whisper began to ripple through the car, half apologies, half expressions of shame, as each person contended with the revelation that their inaction had allowed cruelty its unchecked course. The protective man paused, his presence an unyielding testament to the idea that strength is not measured in acts of aggression, but in the courage to hold oneself accountable. His stature, though unremarkable by physical standards, loomed with a moral majesty that transcended the everyday. If you truly believe in justice, he continued, his tone both gentle and commanding, then you must also confess when you do nothing. Honesty is not just about speaking up in moments of light, but about owning your silence in moments of darkness. A hush deepened over the carriage as his words slowly sank in. The passengers who had once recorded the incident for a quick thrill now found themselves faced with the harsher reality. Their indifference had made them complicit in furthering a culture that tolerated abuse. One by one, faces that had been cool and detached transformed under the weight of personal reflection. A young woman buried in her phone looked up and, with a trembling voice, muttered an apology, as if to the unseen victim. A man in a faded tie clutched his chest and closed his eyes, mourning the part of his conscience he had long tried to ignore. In that charged moment, the entire car became a microcosm of collective awakening. What had started as a fleeting episode of public humiliation was now evolving into a profound lesson in empathy and moral courage. The protective man's words had shattered the veneer of casual self-interest and forced everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth about bystander indifference. No longer could they claim ignorance of injustice, for they had witnessed it, and more importantly, they had failed to act. A palpable shift began to ripple through the crowd. Soft sobs replaced earlier snickers, and whispered apologies grew into earnest conversations about responsibility and dignity. Some passengers exchanged glances that were heavy with regret and silent promises never to be passive again. The silence, once oppressive and complicit, was now transformed into a quiet pledge to be better, to intervene, to help, and to speak out in the face of wrongdoing. Outside the window, the train hurtled along its familiar tracks, but inside, everything had changed. The event had laid bare the truth that in moments of cruelty, inaction is a choice, and that every human being carries the duty to protect another's dignity. The protective man, having delivered his stark admonition, returned to his seat, his eyes lingering a moment longer on the faces around him. His simple act of courage had ignited a moral spark that, for many in that crowded car, was long overdue. As the train continued its journey through the busy tunnels of New York City, Every passenger was left to grapple with the echo of those powerful words. In that reflective silence, the truth resonated. Sometimes, the strongest statement is not made by loud shouts or displays of force, but by the quiet confrontation of one's own conscience. And in that truth lay the promise of change, a promise that true strength is measured not by physical might, but by the relentless courage to stand up for what is right. As the train slowed to a stop at the next station, a quiet transformation had taken hold of the entire car. The earlier conflict had subsided into a gentle, reflective calm, a hush laden with remorse and awakening. The passengers, once so eager to record every moment on their phones, now quietly wrestled with the weight of their own silence. In the midst of it all, the protective figure in the battered cowboy hat, whose quiet intervention had become the turning point of the day, stood as a beacon of dignity and moral strength. When the train doors slid open with a soft whoosh into the bright morning light, one by one, the commuters began to gather their belongings. With a purposeful, steady gait, the legendary figure moved from his seat. He paused by Norris, who was still seated on the floor amid the scattered remnants of her grocery bags. Her eyes, darkened with humiliation, yet softening with relief at the unexpected kindness, lifted as he extended a large, calloused hand to help her pick up the spilled items. The simple act of picking up a fallen apple, a bruised loaf of bread, and a few loose vegetables felt like the culmination of a quiet promise that even when injustice seemed overwhelming, compassion could still mend what cruelty had fractured. As Annie gathered her groceries with his help, the once silent witnesses to the incident began to stir. A few passengers, their faces now pinched with regret, exchanged glances that spoke of awareness and a need for change. From one corner of the car, an elderly woman, who had hitherto kept her eyes cast downward, leaned over to a fellow passenger and softly whispered, "It was Chuck Norris." Her voice was barely audible, yet it carried the weight of a long-forgotten truth, a nod to the storied past where legends not only fought but also inspired others to do better. But the transformative moment was far from over. As the crowd's murmurs began to fade into a reflective silence, the protective man, now recognized by many as the embodiment of unwavering integrity, moved purposefully over to where several passengers still clutched their smartphones. With a measured and stern resolve, he addressed them in a low, resonant tone that cut straight to the soul of the matter. "You can post this video, but if you do, include the truth that you remained silent while this woman was being harmed." A heavy pause followed his words. For an eternity captured in mere seconds, every person in the car felt the sting of that statement. Phones dropped and faces flushed with acute embarrassment. Eyes, once fixated on screens for narcissistic validation, now brimmed with tears and remorse. The courage of one man had stripped bare the hypocrisy of their inaction. The digital evidence, the very footage they were eager to share, suddenly felt tainted by their collective silence. Some could not hold back a tear, while others muttered apologies or admitted under their breath how they should have acted sooner. That single sentence rang out as a potent call to conscience, echoing off the metal walls of the train and reverberating in the hearts of everyone present. In the midst of this charged atmosphere, the bully's earlier cruelty now seemed insignificant compared to the moral lesson he had inadvertently helped ignite. The once viral video, destined to be yet another piece of mindless content for public consumption, now carried the heavy burden of truth. It was no longer simply a record of a moment of arrogance but a testament to the power of bystander inaction, and, more importantly, the promise of accountability that courage can demand. As the crowd began to disperse, the protector quietly resumed his seat, his mission of defense seemingly complete for the moment. Annie, with a few hesitant but grateful smiles exchanged with him, gathered her remaining belongings and stood slowly. Around her, other passengers gathered in a silent act of solidarity. They stepped off the train with a new understanding of their own responsibilities, a poignant realization that true strength is not in passive observation but in the willingness to stand up, however quietly, for those who cannot defend themselves. In the final moments before the doors slid shut once again, one voice, soft, almost inaudible, rose above the silence. A timid, almost reverent whisper came from an older man seated at the back of the car. Sometimes the strongest are not those who fight, but those who do not let evil win, even with silence. That whispered truth hung in the air as the train pulled away, carrying with it not only souls destined for the hurried pace of New York City, but also a solemn vow that injustice would no longer be tolerated in the shadows of indifference. For the onlookers, it was a transformation of hearts, a moral epiphany that echoed long after they had stepped off the train. Each would carry the lesson forward, that when you witness cruelty, your silence becomes part of the crime, and true power lies in speaking up, however softly it may be. That day, a single man's quiet valor had redefined an entire morning, instilling a hope that even in the most crowded spaces, kindness and accountability could prevail. Subscribe if you believe that justice has a voice. Don't miss the next story. There's always a deeper lesson waiting to be learned.